Morning, everybody. Somebody can give me a thumbs up or something. Just let me know that you can see and hear me.
Morning.
Or talk to me. Thank you. Good enough. Okay. Well, another day, another dollar, right? We're going to wrap up the financial system today. We've got a little bit more to talk about. No new stuff, just adding. We got a video and so forth, and a little bit of current events. And then we'll get started on unemployment. Okay, so if I can do this correctly. Okay, you should be able to see what I'm drawing, right? Hawaii, everyone see that?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. You're probably tired of me hearing it, me saying it. Here we've got, just to set this video up, income minus consumption minus taxes. You saw this last week and in the text. Okay, what do we call that? We got income, and we take away everything we spend, consumer spending and our taxes, and that's, oh boy, private saving, okay? You can see why I don't use this. Private saving. And then we add to that taxes minus government spending. And this is public saving. Okay, so keep in mind that the taxes here, that's income to the government, and then minus their spending. So all of this is income minus spending, income minus spending, and what left over is is savings. And we add the public and private savings to get our total savings, or I think the book might call it national savings. And the part at the very end, the last thing we did, well, we drew supply and demand curves, and we put on here the real interest rate. Oh my goodness. Real interest rates. And this is the market for loanable funds. And when we're talking about this here, we're talking about the supply of loanable funds. Savings is the supply of loanable funds. And of course, this is all equal to investment. Let's don't forget that. So a little review of what we did last week. And supply, anything that increases this left side will increase supply of loanable funds. So this here, one of the items that can affect the supply of loanable funds is whether or not the government runs a budget deficit, a budget surplus, balanced budget. And we went through that. So if taxes are $100, tax income, tax revenue to the government, and government spending is 100, we've got a balanced budget, right? They're spending exactly what they're bringing in through tax revenues. And, oh, whoops. If they spend, I was afraid of that. If they spend 110, okay, yeah, we're living here we go. Well, no, that's really good. If they spend $110, they're running a deficit. They're spending more than they bring in, and they have to borrow the extra 10, right? They go out into the bond market and issue treasury bonds, treasury notes, treasury bills. They're all government debt. Bills are short-term, less than a year, typically 13 weeks, and notes up to 5 years, and bonds 10 to 30, even 30 years. So each year's deficit is the total debt. You keep adding total debt as each year's annual deficit. So deficits, a deficit will make this number negative. So this is a negative 10. This is a negative 10, which reduces overall savings. So when you add private savings to public savings, you're actually subtracting 10. We call that crowding out, or government spending over and above what they bring in through taxes crowds out private investment. And I've talked a little bit about that since the economy is, pretty much shut down right now, that hasn't been an issue. And maybe the inflation we've been expecting from so much stimulus from the Federal Reserve Bank. I know I'm talking about things we're going to get to later in the course. Maybe this is why we haven't seen the inflation. This pandemic pretty much just an external shock to the economy that was otherwise rolling right along. But we'll have to see. I guess our economic growth right now is firmly dependent, not on economic policy, but on finding a cure, a solution to this pandemic. Well, what we're going to do now is look at a video that talks about some of the history of deficits. They should, it used to be we didn't run deficits. We're scared to death of debt. And that kind of changed with the Great Depression, where John Maynard Keynes came along and said, look, you got to run deficits. You got to prime the pump here. Government's got to step in. And again, more stuff we'll talk about in the future in the class. And so they started running temporary deficits. That was the idea, just to temporarily juice up the economy, to prime the pump, so to speak. But in times of economic expansion, see, the idea was then to pay back those deficits, pay back that debt. Well, then along came World War II. Well, actually, World War II really ended the Great Depression. The massive government spending there for World War II is actually what brought the Great Depression to an end. And of course, they did borrow heavily in World War II to finance the war. But then Keynesian economics got a little out of hand. John Maynard Keynes, he did not advocate for borrowing or running deficits during normal times. But they started doing that. Fine-tuning was born. And today, jumping ahead, we run deficits constantly now, constantly piling up the debt. And that is getting to be a concern now. Politicians have addressed, every president long I remember has addressed it about how we've got to figure this out. And they very eloquently, as you'll see in the video, say we cannot run deficits year after year after year. But in the end, politics prevails over economics, and absolutely nothing is done. So let's go ahead and watch. Okay. I guess I better hit the right button. There we go. And make sure I hit the right button here. There we go. And here we go. Chime in if you can't see or hear this.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg Learner.
They were immigrant garment workers, uneducated, unskilled, and underpaid.
How could they fight for a living wage? For 40.
Okay, well, that was really good, guys. That's the wrong video. Let me find the right one. We are going to watch this one later on when we talk about unemployment, but that is not the one. Wait, that's not timeout. Here we go. You still with me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. That always makes me feel better. Thank you. Here we go.
We can't see it.
We can't
Can't
see
see
it.
it.
We can't see.
Okay, thank you for telling me. Yes, indeed. Okay. Ah, geez. Can you see now?
Yep, we can see
Yeah.
it.
Can you see where it says federal deficits, macroeconomics?
Yes.
Ah,
Yeah.
thanks. Here we go.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg Learner.
Our war program for the coming fiscal year will cost $56 billion.
1945. By the war's end, the price tag will pass $200 billion. How will we pay for World War II? 1960. As President Eisenhower talks of paying off the national debt, the economy stumbles into a recession. How can a budget surplus hurt the economy? In 2011, crisis was at hand.
There's no doubt that we're going to have to also address the long-term quandary of a government that routinely and extravagantly spends more than it takes in.
Just how would the government respond?
For almost every year in the past 50 years, the federal government has spent more money than it takes in. Year after year, the tide of red ink rolls in. Federal deficits, can we still live with them? We'll investigate that question with the help of economic analysts Nariman Baravish and Richard Gill on this 21st century edition of Economics USA. I'm David Shoemaker.
Most of us have been taught that to spend more money than we earn is to court financial disaster. But the federal government seems to play by a different set of rules. Almost every year, the country runs a deficit. Yet we're told that that deficit is necessary, even beneficial. But deficits piled one on top of another create a growing national debt. And the interest payments on that debt add more dollars to the next year's deficit. During a 5-year span back in the 1940s, our national debt more than quadrupled as we fought World War II. How did we pay for that war? And why didn't it bankrupt us? Early in the morning of September 1st, 1939, German armies marched into Poland, and the world exploded into war. By 1940, the Germans controlled Europe and were poised to attack Britain. A frightened American Congress appropriated $37 billion for defense, more than the entire cost of World War I. How would the government raise these huge sums?
That means taxes and bonds and taxes.
Treasury official Roy Blau remembers.
Now, the Treasury view, and I shared it, was you get as much out of taxes as you can, and up to 100%. Now, of course, we never succeeded in doing that. You take the whole war period, the tax revenues for the war period were a little less than half of the total. The rest of it was borrowed.
In England, economist John Maynard Keynes urged the American government to borrow from a pool of money created by a compulsory savings program. But a group of young American economists had a better idea, as Richard Gilbert recalls.
The group which I led proposed to finance the war through borrowing, in itself not different from the Keynesian proposal, but with a direct control of prices and wages to prevent the kind of inflation that had always been associated with war in the past, and to bring to full employment as rapidly as possible the enormous energies of the American public once harnessed to the effort.
As an airplane worker, I ask all of you to help support our armed forces by buying more war bonds and stamps. As our boys would say, you buy 'em, we'll fly 'em.
This is a working man's country, and I'm doing my part to keep it that way. Buy more bonds today.
Fresh from a decade of hunger and deprivation, the American people cheerfully loaned dollars by the billions to their government. As the war intensified, the economy boomed. 15 million Americans went to war. 66 million more went to work. For the first time in 10 years, Americans had money to spend, but little to spend it on. Not only were luxuries unavailable, but such basics as housing were hard to come by.
All construction was limited except by license. The production of cars and other durables was totally eliminated for the war period. In other words, there could be no private investment other than that required for the war effort. And the result was that if the government had not borrowed these sums that were being saved in the community and not invested, the result would have been not full employment, but another depression.
Government tax revenues increased dramatically throughout the war, but government expenditures increased even more. By the war's end, the federal government had borrowed almost $200 billion, a quarter of it from private individuals, most of the rest from the banking system. The deficits were huge, and the national debt quadrupled in only 4 years.
Dr. Blau, what would have happened if we had tried to pay as we went for World War II?
I think it would have probably been rather harmful to the economy. I have sometimes extravagantly said we would have lost the war. If we'd have tried to do it by pay-as-you-go, we would have had to impose very much more of a dictatorship on the community than we did have to.
The end of the war found the country facing a huge national debt. Yet somehow the $260 billion we owed in 1945 did not seem as terrifying as the $40 billion we'd owed in 1939. The nation was prosperous, and as the economy grew, tax revenues increased and government expenses declined. And years later, as all those billions of dollars of World War II bonds came due, the government simply borrowed new money to pay the old obligation. The nation had gone deeply into debt to pay for the war. That debt never really went away. It just seemed to shrink in size compared to the total GNP. We asked economic analyst Richard Gill if this meant that we had passed on the cost of the war to future generations.
The simple answer is no. The basic costs of World War II were borne by the generation that lived and worked during World War II. Look at it in terms of the old standbys, guns and butter. We start before the war with an economy that is producing only butter, that is, civilian goods. Now, when the war comes, we have to divert some of our resources to gun production. The economic cost of the war is borne right then and there, and is basically the amount of butter we have to give up because we are producing armaments. The cost of the war in terms of lost butter production was minimal, because we entered the war from the Great Depression with enormous unused capacity and unemployment in the economy. To a great degree, we were able to add gun production onto our previous butter production by simply employing these unused resources. In one basic way, the war did impose direct costs on the next generation. Our civilian production is composed not only of consumption goods like butter, but also investment goods, factories, machines, and the like, to increase future production. Insofar as the war replaced investment, I, with guns, G, we left a smaller productive capacity to the next generation. But what about the interest payments on the debt? Aren't these a cost to future generations? They are, and we'll indicate how later on. For the moment, we should bear in mind that because of the enormous growth of the American economy in the decades following the war, federal interest payments as a percentage of our GNP remained low, around 1.5%. And this percentage was actually falling from 1946 to the mid-1960s. It was for this reason that most economists of the time took the line, the national debt? No problem. Our growing economy will take care of it.
1960 would be President Eisenhower's last year in office. He had just run the biggest peacetime deficit in U.S. history, a result of the recession of 1958. He promised the American people a budget surplus in 1960. And on that rock, the presidential aspirations of Richard Nixon would soon founder. What could possibly be wrong with a budget surplus? The prosperity that began with the end of World War II continued through the Eisenhower years with only minor interruptions. But 1958 seemed to be a sharp step backwards, the deepest recession since the 1930s. The government pumped money into the economy to stimulate a quick recovery, spending on such projects as the Interstate Highways Program. This spending during a recession was called a counter-cyclical policy, and it worked. By 1959, the economy was improving. President Eisenhower wanted to leave office with a balanced budget, so he began to push hard for a surplus in 1960. But Vice President Nixon was running for president that year. He wanted a growing economy, so he argued for a deficit. Many economists agreed with Nixon, but Ike stuck to his guns. His chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Raymond Saunier, remembers the pressure.
You don't have any problem with how much money is going to be spent. You are surrounded by people prepared at the drop of a hat to spend untold amounts of money. That's never a problem. What the problem is to raise the funds to meet that. So if we were pushing hard in 1960, and my recollection is that we were pushing hard to reach this equivalence of income and outgo.
Many of his advisors thought Eisenhower did not have time to oversee a complete recovery from the recession of 1958, that his drive for a budget surplus was premature. They urged him to continue spending to fuel the recovery. 1960 was Ike's last year in office. Perhaps he thought inflation was a more serious threat than unemployment. But as the economy stalled, the president did not seem worried.
1960, he was leaving office. He was not running again. The pains of the recession did not, that we were having in 1960, were not so evident to him as the pains of the 1954 recession had been. They were pretty evident to Mr. Nixon.
I was going to say, at least he was running.
Who was running, and he was very unhappy about the situation.
We didn't expect that the next president was going to be John Kennedy. The next president was going to be Richard Nixon. I think that was pretty generally the expectation in the Republican family. Certainly was my expectation. So Eisenhower went out in that message with a strategy that left tax reduction for the next president.
Nixon urged Eisenhower to stimulate the economy with an immediate tax cut. Ike declined. By midsummer, the economy had ground to a halt well short of full employment. The budget surplus was holding money out of the economy and costing workers their jobs. While John Kennedy campaigned on a promise to get the country moving again, Richard Nixon was forced to publicly support a policy he privately opposed. The country hit bottom just 2 weeks before the election. For Nixon, the damage had been done.
If the present trend continues, if Mr. Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, will be the next president of the United States.
Kennedy won with a margin so narrow that people still argue over what tipped the balance. But Nixon had no doubt. He blamed the recession of 1960 for costing him the election. Historians still argue over the significance of the recession of 1960. But economists at the time were convinced that the budget surplus cost the economy jobs and growth by keeping dollars in the hands of the government rather than consumers. Had Eisenhower been willing to end his presidency with a deficit, he might have presented his successor with more growth and the prospect of even larger surpluses in the future. We asked economic analyst Richard Gill to explain why economists might be opposed to budget surpluses.
I've already pointed out that the federal interest payments and the national debt itself were falling all through the 1950s as a percentage of our national income. Thus, there seemed no urgent reason to try for a budget surplus at this time. More significantly, the predominant Keynesian view of the time said that the government ought to pursue a counter-cyclical policy. This would involve budget deficits in bad times to expand the economy and budget surpluses in good times to keep things in check. Suppose the economy is experiencing a business cycle and GNP is going up and then down. What the government ought to do, most economists in 1960 were saying, is follow this course. Budget deficits during the recessions, budget surpluses during the booms. The idea was that this would lead to a much smoother path. So smooth, in fact, that many economists began asking the question, is the business cycle a thing of the past? A question, sadly, which proved to be a bit premature, as indeed did our complacency about the national debt.
We are on course for budget surpluses for the next 25 years.
Well, not exactly. President Clinton's 1998 projection could not have been more optimistic. In 2010, the federal deficit was $1.3 trillion, and the national debt stood at $14 trillion. That was more than 96% of GDP. Everyone on Capitol Hill agreed that the deficit had to be cut and the budget balanced. But would the lawmakers be able to find a bipartisan solution? America has fought 4 wars: Vietnam, Iraq I and II, and Afghanistan, almost entirely without raising taxes to pay for them. In addition, while entitlement programs devour an ever-increasing chunk of the budget, politicians continue to use tax cuts as a great way to get reelected. So how have these increases in spending and decreases in taxes been funded? Through borrowing. But borrowing has a cost to it: interest. In 2011, almost $500 billion. How to fix the deficit and how to balance the budget are complicated questions.
There's no doubt that we're going to have to also address the long-term quandary of a government that routinely and extravagantly spends more than it takes in.
America's runaway deficit prompted President Barack Obama to establish a bipartisan national commission on fiscal responsibility and reform. There were 18 members, including the co-chairs, former Republican Senator Alan Simpson and Democrat Erskine Bowles, Chief of Staff in the Clinton administration. But in 2010, politicians from both sides of the aisle agreed it was time for answers, time for solutions, as the moment of truth had arrived.
It's 67 pages. It's written in English. It wasn't written for pedants or panders or politicians or journalists. It was written for the American people. It uses terms like going broke, shared sacrifice, and where we are. If you spend more than you earn, you lose your butt. And secondly, if for every buck you spend, you borrow 40 cents to do it, you've got to be stupid. And that's your country right now.
Economist Alice Rivlin also sat on the commission.
Well, when any group of people sits down and looks at the federal budget going forward over the next 10 years, they see, first, we can't go on like this. We are borrowing more and more every year.
Rivlin says we are borrowing more because spending is rising rapidly for the health care entitlement programs, Medicare and Medicaid. To compound the problem, these health care costs will soar even higher as the baby boom generation retires.
When you take more older people, higher health care, you multiply the two, it means that without changing the law or changing anything, federal spending is going to grow faster than the economy can possibly grow, and the revenues won't. So that's the problem.
So we're back to the question, how do we fix the problem? After a year of hard work and compromise, the Simpson-Bowles Commission came up with a daring proposal to cut the deficit by $4 trillion over the next decade. Daring because nothing was off limits. It called for $200 billion from all agencies, including the Pentagon. $100 billion squeezed out of the tax code. And most important, it called for reform of the entitlement programs, both health care spending and Social Security, to ensure long-term solvency.
The fun and games is over. The BS is over. The crap. And when you hear a politician of either stripe or either sex get on their hind legs and say, we can get this done, thank God it came up, we're going to get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse, all foreign aid, all earmarks, Nancy Pelosi's airplane, Air Force One, all congressional pensions, and all the rest. Great, that'll get us about 6% out of the hole we're in. So then you say to that person, thank you so much for that drivel you just gave us. Now what the hell are you going to do with Medicare, Medicaid, and the solvency of Social Security? Not balancing the budget on the backs of poor old seniors and calling us the cat food commission, to make it solvent and then do something with the defense budget, which is 2/3 of the discretionary budget of the United States.
The report was supported by 11 of the 18 members of the commission, including both Simpson and Bowles, but it did not get the 14 votes required for passage by the full commission.
I thought it was a remarkable moment. Everyone had very low expectations for the commission. I had perhaps the lowest, I'll be honest about that, because commissions don't have a great track record in the United States. Instead, they came out and produced a bipartisan report, substantial support on both sides of the aisle, that said 4 important things. This problem is big. I certainly agree with that. This problem is spending. You can't say this is just the military. You can't say this is just welfare programs. It is everything the federal government is doing. And number 4, if you want more revenue, this system is so broken you need tax reform to get it.
But did the Simpson-Bowles recommendations fall on deaf ears at the highest level? When President Obama announced his fiscal 2012 budget, it reduced the deficit by only $1 trillion, not $4 trillion.
What we've done is we've taken a scalpel to the discretionary budget rather than a machete. That side of the ledger accounts for about 12% of our budget. So we've got a whole bunch of other stuff that we're going to have to do, including dealing with entitlements. Medicare and Medicaid are huge problems. I'm prepared to work with Democrats and Republicans to start dealing with that in a serious way.
Obama's budget ignored many of the panel's proposals regarding the entitlement programs, including raising the retirement age for Social Security and charging wealthy seniors more for Medicare. Was Simpson disappointed in Obama's budget? Did it fly in the face of all that his commission proposed? Simpson insists the president's budget was driven by politics, not policy. He was not surprised that the president avoided entitlements.
That's what he had to do. It's too fragile right now. That's why the Republicans, a week later, did the same thing, played dodge him. The reason is because Obama knew if he came out with the big stuff in this recommendation, he'd be torn to bits, and then the fun would start.
And politics is what makes reducing the deficit so tricky, because no one wants to see cuts in the programs that benefit their own lives. Whether it's for AARP or veterans, special interest groups continue to lobby Congress hard to keep their funding intact. Everyone has to sacrifice, but no one wants to. Given the deep pockets of special interests and the polarization in Congress, can a compromise on the budget be reached? Economists say yes, because the alternative is not an option. The deficit is staggering, and the mission to find a solution is urgent.
This is the moment, because we are in dire straits. This is very serious stuff. We might torpedo our economy if we don't get this solved.
The bad news scenario is one where people actually say, oh my God, they are absolutely not changing their trajectory. We know it doesn't add up. And you get sharp withdrawal of credit from the United States, the kinds of things we saw in Greece and Ireland, and what we lived through in 2008. We have it within our capacity to change course, and I think we should.
Faced with a last-minute government shutdown, the president and congressional leaders reached a compromise. $38 billion to be cut from the 2011 budget, a figure Simpson and Bowles declared won't amount to a hill of beans when it comes to controlling the spiraling debt. When Senator Alan Simpson announced the committee's recommendations in the document, The Moment of Truth, he jokingly said that he and Erskine Bowles will be on the witness protection list when this is all over. But in this case, shooting the messenger just wouldn't help. What would be the ramifications if we fail to act? We asked economic analyst Neriman Baravish.
Few countries have survived the steady rise of their government debt levels unscathed. Circumstances may differ, but most countries that have seen the ratio of their government debt to GDP rise over 100% have suffered some kind of crisis of confidence. This usually means that investors flee the country, pushing up interest rates and pushing down the value of the currency. It is hard to say when something like this could happen to the United States, which after all does have something of a unique role in the global economy. Nevertheless, even the U.S. can't write IOUs indefinitely. At some point, investors will begin to worry that the American government may have some trouble repaying its debt. These investors will then do one of two things: either sell U.S. government bonds and/or demand higher interest rates to hold those bonds. The resulting higher interest rates could do a lot of economic damage. So in the end, inaction is not an option when it comes to the large and growing U.S. national debt.
Every year, we use a good part of our annual budget just to pay the interest on the debt. And still, we continue accumulating debt. In 2011, the Treasury Department asked Congress to increase the nation's debt ceiling. That's a cap set by Congress on the amount of debt the federal government can legally borrow. Increase it to over $14.3 trillion. And that set off another brouhaha. So, do deficits always hurt us? Not always. But can we continue to live with them? Today, the answer is a resounding no. For this 21st century edition of Economics USA, I'm David Shoemaker.
Well, that was just a few years ago. And what has happened since then? Government spending has gone up in response to the pandemic. So where are we now? Well, here's an article from the Wall Street Journal, and that talks about it. More spending to prime the pump, to deal with the shutdown of the economy. Now, no one's going to argue that this is not needed. But the problem is when times are normal and we still outspend our tax revenue coming in, then that doesn't give us very much leeway to spend during an emergency. Just think of it in terms of your own budget. If you're always spending everything you make, and then when an emergency comes along, you don't have any savings to draw upon. Well, it's kind of the same thing here. Here we, let's watch this a little, here's the article, gets into it, and GDP, debt to GDP is about to hit 100%. Yeah, the debt is a concern. Here we go.
The country is headed toward a milestone, a dubious milestone to be sure, but an important one nonetheless. The Congressional Budget Office tells us that the accumulated debt of the U.S. government is going to exceed the
overall economy for the 12-month period that begins on October 1st, that is to say, during fiscal 2021. That is a milestone that has been seen
since the end of World War II. Now, this tells us not just that deficits have been building for a while, which they have been, but that they've been growing with a special speed during the course of the month period that begins.
Sorry about that. I cut the sound.
Accumulated debt of the U.S. government is going to exceed the size of the overall economy for the 12-month period that begins on October 1st, that is to say, during fiscal 2021. That is a milestone that hasn't been seen since the end of World War II. Now, this tells us not just that deficits have been building for a while, which they have been, but that they've been growing with a special speed during the course of this year. And why is that the case? Well, there are three reasons in particular. The first and most obvious one is the cost of the coronavirus pandemic. The government has been spending a lot of money. Congress has appropriated and President Trump has approved $2.7 trillion or so in spending since March to deal with the coronavirus, to deal with health programs that are needed, and to stimulate the economy because of the economic downturn the coronavirus has caused. That's obviously added to the debt at a special high rate. But the other two reasons are more long-term. The second one is that President Trump is a Republican president who simply doesn't seem as concerned about debt as some of his Republican predecessors have been. You know, in the private sector, he once referred to himself as the king of debt, and I think he believes that right now there doesn't seem to be a need to worry so much about accumulating federal deficits. He's been in favor of a big tax cut, not so concerned about cutting the size of government or dealing with the deficit. It was almost $1 trillion annually before the coronavirus hit. Third reason is that Democrats don't seem to be concerned about deficits either. They have been telling themselves and telling others that with interest rates at historically low levels, we shouldn't worry so much about borrowing. Borrowing costs are low. The government should take advantage of it, although they've been arguing for taking advantage of it to invest in things, not simply to spend money. Nonetheless, the concern isn't high among Democrats either. Net result, you have a Washington right now where deficit concerns and worries about the long-term debt are simply not very high. The question really long-term, obviously, is when does this catch up with us? Does it ever catch up with us? Those are the questions that are not answerable right now, but that I think we're going to be dealing with for years to come.
Well, should we worry about it? I think we should be a little more concerned than we are. But right now, the biggest concern is the pandemic and keeping people afloat during this pandemic. That's the immediate concern. And the level of debt is going to be kicked down the road. But one of these days, you know, those who lend money to the government are simply going to require a higher interest rate and higher interest rates because that debt will be seen as more and more risky. And that's when it can start to do some damage. Well, that wraps up that chapter. Now we're going to start on unemployment. You guys are still with me, right? Say a couple words. Thank you. Yeah. I get going. I'm thinking, okay, I don't see anybody. I don't hear anybody, but so I think, oh man, did I cut them off somewhere? Okay. Well, unemployment. I made a mistake in recording this presentation on unemployment in that I just made, instead of chunking it up like I usually do by topic, I just made one big long one, and I didn't realize I did that until after I was already done. So we'll watch a little bit of it, and then I'll just stop it. Okay, we don't want to sit there and just watch me drone on about unemployment, but and we'll watch another video, Paul Salmon video this time on unemployment. But let's just introduce how it's calculated and the different kinds of unemployment. Here we go.
Unemployment is one of our greatest social problems. For example, it has been estimated that a 1 point increase.
It always does that. Here we go.
Unemployment is one of our greatest social problems. For example, it has been estimated that a 1 point increase in unemployment, when I say 1 point, 1 percentage point, say from 5% to 6%, that's a 1 percentage point increase, will lead to, on average, 920 suicides, 648 homicides, 20,240 heart attacks or strokes, 495 deaths from liver cirrhosis, 4,227 admissions to mental hospitals, 3,340 admissions to prisons. So, an enormous issue, and but in here we're not going to focus on that. That's probably the biggest problem with unemployment. Our focus in economics is how it affects the economy, how it affects output, productivity, that kind of thing. So, the dismal science, yes, that's right. Well, the first thing we're going to look at is how is the unemployment rate calculated? Well, the unemployment rate is simply the number of unemployed, number of people unemployed, divided by the number of people in the labor force. It's real simple, but we better define these terms. The labor force is anyone over 16, okay, 16 years of age. I should say 16 or over. Let me fix that, because that's age 16 or over, and who are employed or looking for work. Okay, so if you're employed, obviously you're part of the labor force. But if you're looking for work, you're part of the labor force. Now, if you're not looking for work, you're not part of the labor force. Yes, you're part of the population, but you're not part of the labor force. So are you a full-time student, for example? You're studying all the time, going to class all the time. You're not looking for work. You're not part of the labor force. Now, when you graduate or in the summer, when you're looking for work, you're part of the labor force. So let's calculate that. Let's say, well, unemployment, oh boy, unemployment rate is number of unemployed divided by number of the labor force. And let's say that is, let's say the labor force is 100 people. And of those 100, 5 are unemployed. So you've got a 5% unemployment rate. Okay, 0.05, then multiply by 100 to convert to a percentage. And that's it. It's that simple to calculate. The arithmetic is simple. The finding the data is another matter. First of all, we had to determine that there were 100 people in the labor force. Well, what we have here is it looks like out of the 100, 95 are working, and 5 are looking for work. Now, how do we know 5 are looking for work? Because they say they're looking for work. That's it. They simply say they are. When the Bureau of Labor Statistics contacts their random sample that they do, they ask you if you've been working. If the answer is no, are you looking? If the answer is no, you're not part of the labor force. Okay, so it's difficult to get the data to measure. And among the difficulties, here are some issues that make it difficult. The first issue, problems getting data on unemployment. Okay. One is the discouraged worker. Discouraged workers. Discouraged workers are people who really do want a job, but they've been looking for a long time. So you call up, and so you've got, let's say, 5 out of 100. The unemployment rate is 5%. And Joe keeps saying, he's one of the 5. He keeps saying that he's looking for work, and he's not finding work. And then one time, they contact him, and they ask him, have you been working? No. Are you looking for work? No. What happens to the unemployment rate? Well, Joe is no longer part of the labor force. Therefore, he's not unemployed. So, Joe drops out of the labor force. The labor force goes from 100 down to 99. He's not unemployed anymore, so there's only 4 unemployed now. So what does that do to the unemployment rate? Well, you've got the denominator, the numerator and the denominator going down by the same amount. And when that happens, the whole number falls. So you divide those and you see that's now 4.04%. So the unemployment rate, it falls. This is going to be the reported unemployment rate, 4.04%. And politicians are going to be crowing under my management. Look what we have accomplished. We have brought the unemployment rate down from 5% to 4.04%. Happy days, right? Well, no, because it's falling for the wrong reason. If you get enough discouraged workers, get enough people stop looking for work, you're going to look pretty good as a politician. And yeah. Politics and economics, right? Always the clash, it seems. But anyway, discouraged workers are a big issue, and people do get discouraged, and they give up after a while. and they just don't feel like there's anything out there. And the unemployment numbers actually look better as a result. So the discouraged worker problem, it understates unemployment. This is the number we get. This is the real number. Okay. Well, another issue in collecting accurate data for unemployment is the underemployed. Underemployed. Oh boy, well, let's say you're building rockets for NASA and you're smart and you're got a big bucks job, and suddenly you're laid off. They're not building as many rockets anymore. And so you're unemployed. So what happens? Okay, what happens? Here's the unemployment rate, 5%. And then they lay you off, okay, and you're looking for work. So the labor force is still 100. Now you're unemployed. So it used to be 5 out of those 100 were unemployed. Now you're laid off, and now the unemployment rate's gone up to 6%. But you decide while you're looking for a job, a real job, to your level of intellect and skills, you decide to go get a job at Wendy's. Little job at Wendy's, they give you a free lunch, let you have a free burger, so you figure, why not? I'm just sitting around, I'll go flip some burgers. So, if they call you now, guess what? Are you working? Yeah. Hey, great. Yeah, I'm flipping burgers down at Wednesday. You can tell them the whole story all you want. But you know what? This is the unemployment rate. You're one of these. Well, you're one of these. You're not one of those. You're one of the 95 working instead of the 94. Okay? So you are working, flipping burgers, and there's no difference between flipping burgers and building rockets in the unemployment statistics. Okay? So, the underemployed also understates unemployment. Okay? It really ought to be this, the 6%, but you know what? This is what gets reported. And the phantom unemployed. Well, I'll tell you what, I've known people do this, and I bet you have too. It's not very good. It is not a good thing to do, but you know what? Some people don't want to go back to work. They're laid off and they don't want a job. But you know what? To keep those unemployment benefits coming, they got to at least act like they are looking. They got to go through the motions. So they got to go have job interviews and stuff like that. And they deliberately sabotage them. They dress inappropriately. They do things that they know they won't get a job offer. And I've seen this done. I knew someone who got laid off starting her own business and went through the hoops for a while, working hard on her business, one of those unemployment benefits coming in. I bet you we can all tell stories about that, someone who did this. So what's going on here? Well, here's the unemployment rate. It's 5%. And they get laid off, which And if they're genuinely looking for a job, it's this. It goes up to 6% because the labor force stays at 100. But what is the unemployment rate really? What's really happening here? It shouldn't be this. The bottom line is what really happened. What really ended up happening is you dropped out of the labor force, right? You're done. You're not really in the labor force anymore. So you have to be in the labor force to be unemployed. So this is the real situation, and we're back. The actual unemployment rate, yeah, it has fallen, but the official numbers are this. Because you keep saying, if you're contacted by the BLS, yeah, I'm looking for a job. I'm looking for a job. So this is the number. These are the numbers recorded. This is the reality. So the phantom unemployed, it overstates unemployment. So all this makes measuring unemployment very difficult. So, and what is also difficult is determining what is considered full employment. What is considered a fully employed economy?
Okay, well, let's take a break from me and see what Paul Salmon has to say about this. Here we go.
The traditional ticket to a really good job in America, a degree from business school.
Okay, guys, you're going out and earning 6 figures.
Instead of cheese, the dean of the Rutgers Business School in Camden, New Jersey, used the carrot of wealth to get his 4-year grads and MBAs to smile for the camera in the teeth of a grim reality of recent years, a so-called jobless economic recovery.
Yeah, looking forward.
No matter how good these kids looked, though, they considered their job prospects dreary.
On a scale of 1 to 10, sort of with your voices, so I guess it's yeah, it's a something like that. What's the job market out there like at the moment?
But why were students groaning when, at the time of this graduation, the official U.S. unemployment number was only 5.8%, certainly not high by historical standards? In 1982, for example, the rate was over 10%. In the Great Depression, something like 25%. So what do we make of today's unemployment number? That's the purpose of this video, as well as to show you the several different types of unemployment, and finally, so what?
Now, the monthly unemployment number is gathered by government survey takers like Joanne Burns.
I'm Joanne Burns. I'm with the United States Census Bureau, and we just need a little information.
Joanne Burns is keeping track of unemployment in the Newark, New Jersey area, one of some 2,000 government employees who have 1 week each month to track down and survey 35 households. 60,000 households are in the sample.
There's also a separate survey of businesses, the so-called establishment survey that tracks the creation of new jobs. But this is the household survey, begun in 1940 with pen and paper. Today, it's conducted with a computer. For the statistics to be accurate, every interview counts. But it's not always easy to get people to open up.
Sometimes when you have a difficult person who turns you away the first time or so, send them a card. When you go back the next time and you say, oh, did you get my card? Oh, was that you? I said, yes, that was me. Oh, come in. Beautiful card, and you got them. You go in and you do the interview.
The efforts of people like Joanne Burns and the work of more than 200 phone interviewers result in a response rate of better than 90%.
How many hours per week does she usually work at her job?
The responses become the unemployment number reported the first Friday of each month. For simplicity, let's exaggerate and say there were 14 million unemployed this month. Let's also assume a workforce of 140 million. This would produce an official unemployment rate of 10%. So what, you say? Well, as we've explained before when introducing the trusty old production possibilities curve,
An economy is always trying to produce on the curve instead of inside it. That is, imagine that the curve or frontier represents everything the economy can provide. Say, every possible good on one axis, every possible service on the other. If it uses the resources efficiently, the best way it can, then it'll be somewhere on the frontier. This much of goods, this much of services, or perhaps this much and this much.
But now suppose there's unemployment. People who are lining up for jobs but can't get them. They could be fixing your roof, helping me with my business, making stuff for all of us. But they're not. So the economy at less than full employment is not doing as much as it could, but somewhat less, and thus finds itself inside the curve, not at maximum production.
Another important thing to understand is that there isn't just one kind of unemployment. In fact, there are 3 different kinds, which we're now going to introduce: structural, cyclical, and frictional.
Take this job and shove it. I ain't working here no more.
What kind of unemployment is this?
Take this job and shove it. I ain't working here no more. My woman done left and took all the reasons I've been working for. I don't remember the rest of it, but you get the idea, right? So he's telling his boss to kiss off. He's quitting.
The late country singer, disgruntled Johnny Paycheck, had a vivid way of expressing his type of unemployment. But
what type of unemployment would we call that? Is that cyclical unemployment? Did he lose his job because the whole economy is going in the tank? No. Did he lose? Is it a structural unemployment? Is what happened to him peculiar to one particular industry? No. So that means he would be considered part of frictional unemployment. Frictional is the people in between jobs, people who have quit jobs or people entering and re-entering the job market. And in a big economy like ours with close to 300 million people, you're always going to have that. You're always going to have some frictional unemployment. It's just, you know, the workings of the machine. It's, you know, the gears turning.
Now, when Mr. Paycheck suggested that his boss take the gig and put it where the sun don't shine, as many of us would sometimes like to, he was what's called a job leaver. By making the decision to quit and search for a better situation, he made himself part of the official unemployment rate. He presumably looked for work in the next month, but he wasn't going to take just anything. This is an example of frictional unemployment, as Professor Fay pointed out. People moving in and out of jobs, or as in the case of the Rutgers grads, new entrants perhaps, moving into the job market for the first time. Structural unemployment is longer term. There's a change in the structure of the economy, and thus jobs are moving from one industry or location to another, such as when technological change in the auto or steel industries force blue-collar layoffs, or when service sector jobs are outsourced to other countries.
The black bra and the CD recorder will be delivered by 6 p.m. Friday.
And finally, there's cyclical unemployment, job loss due to economic downturns. We've seen this happen in the recession of the early 2000s, the market crash that led to the Great Depression. Some economists add a fourth type, seasonal unemployment. When you lose your ski lift job, for example, or your early spring stint helping taxpayers at the local H&R Block. The point is that when economists talk about full employment, they don't mean a rate of 0. Because, as Mr. Paycheck and others illustrate, there are variables that make a certain amount of unemployment inevitable. In fact, due to frictional, structural, and even seasonal unemployment, the official unemployment rate has never been lower than 2.9%. Remember, though, if Mr. Paycheck or any job leaver didn't look for a job in the past month, he or she wouldn't be counted as officially unemployed, just as these students wouldn't be if they weren't looking for work. Now for a last point about the unemployment number. In recent years, some economists have begun to wonder if the monthly number isn't undercounting actual unemployment. There are, it turns out, 3 reasons why that might be so.
I need a job, for real.
Yes, help us out.
After today, no, right now, I'll be looking for a job.
When we interviewed them, not one of these Chicago 20-somethings had worked in the past year, giving them much in common with David Jones, who has advanced degrees in engineering and business.
So let's see what that does to our performance.
Jones had lost his financial consulting job more than a year ago. He was doing work for a friend in real estate, but would only get paid if the project panned out. But none of these young men was part of the official unemployment number because all of them were too discouraged to look for work in the previous month.
I bet I would have been one of those people who was not counted in the unemployment statistics. The job market was pretty tough, and particularly in Chicago. So I was not looking for a little while.
Neither, says Jones, were many of his friends. So they're what the government calls discouraged workers, not officially unemployed, but out of the workforce entirely, as all of these young men were.
Have you looked for work in the last 4 weeks?
No.
Have you looked for work in the last 4 weeks?
No.
So
I basically, really, honestly, I gave up.
Now, for our purposes, it doesn't really matter why all these people aren't looking for work, only that none of them were being counted as unemployed. Then there's a second growing group of non-working Americans that goes uncounted, especially when jobs become scarce. Those who leave the workforce to get government disability. Economist David Otter is the expert here.
Approximately 1% of all adults ages 16 to 64 are applying for disability every year.
How do you account for this?
When jobs disappear, when opportunities are rare, people look for other means of income replacement. It's a lifetime of income replacement plus medical benefits.
And third, there's prison. Today, more than 2 million American men are behind bars. And these men would otherwise have a huge unemployment rate, says Diane Williams, who runs a Chicago program for ex-offenders, the SAFER Foundation.
Approximately a third of the people who were incarcerated were in fact working at the time of incarceration. 2/3, therefore, were not employed before going into the institution and obviously are not likely to be employed coming out.
The bottom line is that when you add the imprisoned to the disabled and the discouraged, you get unemployment far higher than the monthly number the government reports. Then add those with part-time work looking for full-time.
Add those looking for jobs a lot more challenging than the ones they've got. Even add those who are working harder than they want to, forced overtime, for example. And in the end, you've got a very different picture of the job market than the official data suggest. And more importantly, an economy operating well inside its production possibilities frontier, even though the current unemployment number may sound low.
Remember, since the whole point of economics is the production of as much as possible of what we most want, food, videos, for some of us hair, unemployment is a cost to us as consumers. That is, people are sitting idle who could be trying to provide what we want. And in addition, of course, unemployment can be a devastating cost to those who happen to be unemployed. They're hurt as consumers, of course, but unemployment also seems to lead to poorer physical and mental health. And that, in turn, tends to cost all of us, since the ill wind up relying on public services, which we all pay for. In that sense, unemployment is also a negative externality to the economy as a whole. Last but not least, remember those gloomy Rutgers grads? As members of the frictionally unemployed, they're an inevitable and, in a sense, deliberate feature of the labor market. But that's probably little consolation to them. And they might even stir an economist's sympathy by pointing out that the key factor of production they represent, labor, is being underutilized as they look for work.
All right, well, let's pull the plug there. And let me try something. We got a few minutes here. Let me just see. I haven't been really keeping track of who's here, and I probably should. And I've been meaning to start this chat thing, and whoa, there it is. Chat. Would that be of any interest to have a chat thing going on in the corner or something? Anybody there?
We could just talk, we could unmute our mics.
Yeah, unmute. Are you not able to unmute? Well, yeah, you just unmuted. Okay, well, that's good. That sounds good. Just thinking out loud here. Well, we'll continue on with unemployment on Thursday. And remember, the financial system is due Thursday night. Hopefully you're well into that. Then the exam is next Tuesday, a week from today. There won't be any class, so you can utilize that time certainly to take the exam. Any questions or anything? Shoot.
So the next chapter on MindTap is due on Thursday?
No. Well, this chapter is unemployment is not due Thursday, but the financial system is due Thursday. Yeah, and I
what do you mean by that? Is that on MindTap or is it on Blackboard?
Well, over here, can you see my cursor? The chapter 26, the financial system.
Yep.
You go into MindTap, and yeah, those questions in MindTap are we wrapped up chapter 26 last time. Really, I mean, we added some meat to it today, brought it to life a little bit, or at least tried to. This one, chapter 26.
All right, so have that done by Thursday night.
Yeah, Thursday night. I can extend that a little bit since the exam's not till Tuesday, but anybody want a little more time on it?
I would like some. Like Sunday or something?
Yeah, okay. I'm easy. Sunday, I'll do it. Well, you know what? I'll do it right before your eyes so I don't forget. Let's see. Well, usually there's a little thing that opens at the bottom. There we go. I'll get rid of this. Whoops. Find the right chapter? Yeah. Maybe I didn't have it do that. What's Sunday? The 1st?
Thank you.
Okay, that should say November 1st. All right. And then the exam's on Tuesday. And if, you know, yeah. So if you need more time, you know, obviously we're going to run out of time at some point. We got to maintain a budget on time. But during these unusual times and teaching the class in this manner, I know this isn't what you signed up for. Certainly I'm going to be as flexible as I possibly can. Okay. But don't take me to the cleaners. That's all I ask, is don't intentionally take advantage of me. We're going to run out of time eventually. The semester is going to come to an end. So we only have limited flexibility, but as flexible as I can be, certainly I will be. So any questions, comments, anything? We still have 3 minutes.
Appreciate it, Mr. Foreman.
All right, guys. It's been a pleasure as always. I just wish I could see you or be with you. It's kind of lonely here talking into a computer. Feel free to put your cameras on. I'm not going to make you. One of my colleagues, and you got to be careful of those cameras. One of my colleague, there was a young lady who had her camera on, and she got out of bed and was in her underwear, and you don't want to do that. So you be careful of that camera. So I'll see you Thursday, and have a good week. See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.